Hey everyone, it's Mr. Wobbly94. I hope you're doing well today. I have a book review for the original version of Stephen King's The Stand, the 1978 copy here in hardcover. It's a little hard to come by. This is out of print. Of course, if you go to Barnes & Noble or something now to pick up The Stand, you're getting the expanded and uncut edition, which is about anywhere in paperback from 1,200 pages to 1,500 pages, depending on what publisher put it out. Now, I read the uncut version about 10 years ago, and it's a little too much for me, a little bloated, too slow in a lot of ways. There's just too much information in there. This cut version, the original release abridged version, is about 800 pages long, and I love it. I personally think it's a better book overall. I think there's very few things that suffer. There's a couple of nitpicks I have about it, but really not enough, because if you read this before you ever saw the 1994 miniseries, which was my first thing of The Stand I ever had. It was my first time ever experiencing that story. It's still my favorite version of the story compared to the books and the comic book from Marvel. I love that 94 miniseries, but even if you pick up the uncut book, to me, it comes across as a better book overall. It's a tighter story overall. The 94 miniseries is a 90s movie, so I love it to death. It's very fun. It has a lot of a great casting, great music. I can never hear Don't Fear the Reaper and not think of that movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all time, probably my top 10 favorite movies of all time. But anyway, getting back to this, I have not read this ever. This is the first time I've ever read this original version, and again, I've only read the uncut one time. And this is a post-apocalyptic story, in case you've never heard of The Stand. It is a crazy, lengthy, wild journey to only cover about 6 months, not including the final chapter of the book that includes like the next year of time. I gotta tell you, I love the book. I think this is a fantastic book. It's one of Stephen King's best books he ever wrote. And the reason they originally cut this down, just in case you don't know, from the 1,200 or 1,500 page original book down to this version of the book to originally release it, was because the publishers didn't think, they thought it would cost too much, basically, to publish that big old huge book, and they didn't think it would sell as well. And it turns out they're kind of right. Of course, this is following up Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, and Night Shift, which were all bestsellers from what I understand. Maybe not Night Shift, but the other three I'm pretty confident they were. At the time this came out, The Shining by Stanley Kubrick was being filmed, so that's kind of cool. So, to follow those books all pretty much being bestsellers, this 800-page book was not a bestseller. What do you think a 1,200 or 1,500-page version of the book would be? It wouldn't be a bestseller, probably. I really love this. I love this 70s cover here, man. It's just a fantastic read. I'll tell you this, the reason I like this cut version, this abridged version, much, much more than the uncut from 1990's re-release, is because it's a tighter book. It's exactly a great example. If you hold up both the versions of this particular story by the same author, you can tell how much an editor actually matters by reading the two different versions of The Stand. It's a great way to talk about it. It's a really great way to discuss with wannabe authors and whatnot of why an editor is important. There's a lot of crap in the uncut version that I couldn't stand. I didn't think it had any purpose. It didn't need to be there. This is a great proof of that now that I've read that. And I will say, I prefer this book version to the comic book and to the uncut version. Hands down, no question whatsoever. Again, this is a post-apocalyptic story if you've never heard of it. It is a very Christian tale. I'm a Christian myself, so I really found this to be fun to read. I have a lot of cool little Bible references I saw in here that I think a lot of non-Christians would not pick up on. This is basically Stephen King's version of the Book of Revelation in a very liberal way, but still, it's a fantastic book. It's just a wonderful journey with all of these people that you just fall in love with. I love the cast here. Basically, the way the world ends up ending here, for anybody who doesn't know about The Stand, basically a big old super flu is a bioweapon that the government's tinkering around with here in the US. And it gets out of the lab, and basically one guy that works at this lab takes off with his family and travels across the entire country and stopping here and there, spreading this thing all over the place. Everybody's getting sick from this. Now, it kills about 99% of the entire population of the Earth. They call this thing a super flu. They start nicknaming it Captain Trips. This is also adapted from a short story within Night Shift. I think it's called Night Surf, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but there's a short story in there that's from Night Shift that is the original story this was coming from and being adapted from. This is really good. It's a really great book. I really love it. I think the super flu itself is just horrific to watch. People's throats swell up and they basically choke on mucus. It's just a really gross, sick thing to read. People are coming across people's dead bodies that have been dead in their houses and stuff for months and months and months. But this is not so much a charter of events. This is more of a documentation about people that are trying to survive right before the apocalypse, during it, and then after it, once everything's kind of cleared out. Some people are dealing with disease and whatnot. People could need surgeries in the midst of this apocalypse, even if they did survive this big super flu. Now the thing is, the 1% of people who have still lived past that big super flu epidemic, they're immune, and nobody knows why. And you never really find out by the end of the book why people are immune. It's kind of just a weird, odd spiritual thing that we don't really even get to call it that, honestly. Now, the thing is, the people who are still alive start to have these nightmares and dreams. If they dream kind of a pleasant dream, a lot of the time they're dreaming about an old black lady that's in her hundreds named Mother Abigail, and they go off to follow her in either Nebraska, or she moves to Colorado a little bit later on, and they go to follow her. And that's kind of the good side, the side of God, you know? This woman is a Christian. She has this reverence for God. She loves him. She wants to, you know, do his will. She wants to pray to him all the time. And I love the fact that even if Stephen King is not a Christian, a lot of his Christian roots kind of came out in this book, of his history and his family, because you could tell how much of a knowledge of the Bible he actually had for this particular epic. This whole book is an epic, plain and simple. I will tell you that straightforward. No matter which version of the book you read, you're going to get a big epic adventure, and it's great and it's fun. It is so crazy and wild to think of how much goes into the Mother Abigail character and how important she is as kind of a Moses figurehead within this story. Now, if you don't follow after her, but the other person you kind of dream of too, that some people go to follow off to Las Vegas, is named Randall Flagg. And we don't know if he's the Antichrist himself. He kind of represents that. We don't know if he's the devil himself, if he's just a dark magician of some sort, which he has all these abilities no one can really explain. He may be some kind of fallen angel of some sort, or just a straight-up demon, which are kind of the same thing in, you know, theological terminology. But still, Randall Flagg is such a crazy villain. He's always joking and laughing and smiling. He wears a blue jean jacket and blue jeans and cowboy boots, flannel shirts, that kind of thing. He has the coolest villain intro I've ever seen in any book ever, or any piece of fiction for that matter, like compared to like Darth Vader's intro in the original Star Wars film, A New Hope. He is such a scary villain when he gets angry, because you're used to seeing him very jokey, very lighthearted about stuff, lying to people, using propaganda to push people to come to him in Las Vegas, trying to use propaganda to scare people. If you disobey him, he crucifies you. It is a crazy, crazy, crazy book. I will tell you that up front. This book is a very heartfelt book. There's a lot of emotions here. And watching people start to follow either Mother Abigail's group over in Nebraska or Colorado, or follow after Randall Flagg in Las Vegas, watching this world rebuild itself already into chaos, already. And you could argue that it never stopped, because while people were still dealing with this whole epidemic going on, there were people that were looting and burning things down and all kinds of stuff. It was very reflective of 2020, basically. It is a hectic adventure, man. I want to talk about some of my favorite characters in the book, and some of the, pretty much I enjoyed every single character in the book. There's a lot of side characters, like the Rat Man, Amanda, people like that, who did not get as big of a chapter focus in this book, which is good, because I think a lot of that was done in the uncut version, which added hundreds of pages to that version. I didn't like that, like I said. But having this version, you have a lot of characters that are the main focus of the story that get preserved, surprisingly. You'd think hundreds of pages missing from this book compared to the uncut version. I think a lot of people would expect there to be a lot of issue with, you know, character tampering, and there's really not. There's only one character that's actually affected by that, and I'll talk about him in a moment. But kind of summarizing up the main characters that are all here, good and bad, you have Stu Redman, our first character we're really introduced to in the book. I love him. He's all-American. He's played by Gary Sinise. He's so all-American in the 94 miniseries, which I love there. I still have not seen the new miniseries yet. Not really excited to see that, so maybe one day. We'll see. I'm kind of figuring it's probably going to get ruined just like Star Trek and Star Wars are now. But even so, I love Stu Redman, probably one of my favorite characters of all time, tied with another fellow I'll talk about in a moment. Then we have Franny Goldsmith, who is a girl who just got pregnant right on the verge of the apocalypse, and she's a whiny crybaby. I can't stand her. She also knows a kid named Harold who has a crush on her. He's a little bit younger than her. I think they went to school together too, from what I remember it said. I believe it said that. Anyway, Harold is a poet and a wannabe writer and all these things. A very pretentious, but a very smart kid too. Has some weight issues, a lot of acne issues. But he has a lot of confidence issues too, and that's kind of sad on what that kind of makes him act like. He acts like a douchebag, man. He's pretty integral to the story, too, because of some of the things that happen here. Then we get introduced to my other favorite character, Larry Underwood, who is a fellow who's steeped into drugs and debt and all kinds of things after he just recently became famous from playing music and making music for the radio and whatnot. And Larry is such a sleazeball scumbag. As soon as we're introduced to him, he's trying to get money from his mom to try to pay off his debts and stuff that he got into from all his partying and whatnot. But as the book progresses, he's the greatest example I've ever seen in fiction or in just Stephen King literature of a man who starts in a horrible place as a mean, awful person who uses everyone in his life and turns into a great guy, a man of God. I love him. I love Larry Underwood. He's one of the best characters in Stephen King works ever. One of the best characters I've ever read in fiction because of the kind of journey that he goes through as a person. How he grows up. He really honestly grows up. And I love that about him. I love the actor they had playing him in the 94 miniseries as well. And then you have Nick Andros. Nick Andros is a deaf mute who uses a little notebook of paper to try to write out notes to people, and then he can read their lips to kind of hear read their responses that they say back to him, and that's how he communicates with people. One of the first people that he really comes across after a while, after the apocalypse really kind of takes over, is a retarded man named Tom Cullen, who I love to death. In the miniseries from '94, he's played by the guy who plays Patrick Starr, which, by the way, Nick Andros was played by Rob Lowe, of all people. It's a great cast. Great cast. So, Nick Andros is talking to a fellow, Tom Cullen, and Tom Cullen can't read, but he's a big old strong fellow, really tough, cool guy, and they become friends. And the fact that they're able to become friends just by the gestures of what they do versus how they speak to each other is fascinating to me. I love that. It's such a great character set of friendship right there that Stephen King wrote. You can't help but love both of them. You really can't. And then they journey on together most of this book. And then there's some other side characters, like I said, like Ralph and Glenn and their dog Kojak out there, and I love those guys too. They're really cool. I love little Kojak. He's a sweet old fella. I think there's no other characters I'm forgetting about. Like I said, Mother Abigail's a very sweet character too. Then you have the bad guys, the guys that kind of follow along with Randall Flagg. Of course, Randall Flagg is the Antichrist type of character I just mentioned, but then you have kind of his right-hand men, henchmen types, like Lloyd Henry, the guy who was in jail, who was figuring he was probably going to die in jail. Everybody else had died in there. He was the one immune person in there from what we could tell. And Randall Flagg came in and saved him. So he kind of feels like he owes this debt to Randall Flagg. But then you have Trash Can Man, who is the only character affected by any changes or shortening of scenes. I feel like in this particular film, or this particular version of the book, basically Trash Can Man loses a lot of the sympathy that he has. He's more anti-heroic in this book, in my opinion, than he was in the uncut version or in the miniseries from 1994. I'm not a huge fan of Trash Can Man. I love him in the sense of what his purpose is here. He's a pyromaniac nutcase. He's basically the evil version of Tom Cullen, if you will. And he's important here. He's very important. Every character in here pretty much is important. And you have some other characters in here that come across some of our good guys, like Nadine, for example. She's not necessarily a bad guy, but she's kind of integral to both sides and the struggle that those two have for the good versus evil titleship that this whole book focuses on. I really like Stephen King's The Stand, the 1978 version. I personally think that the ending is phenomenal. I know a lot of people out there, especially the non-religious types, hate the ending of this book because of how it feels like a Deus Ex Machina type of ending. I get where you're coming from, you're not wrong, but I still love it. As a Christian, I love it. As just in general, as a Stephen King fan, this is one of the few endings of Stephen King books that I absolutely loved so much. I think it's fantastic. If you've not read this original version of The Stand, you should pick it up and read it. You really should. Don't buy it for like $50, but try to get a copy of a paperback or this copy in a hardcover or something. I love the book tremendously. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read from Stephen King, hands down. Probably my top 10 or 15 of his, easily. Up there with like Bag of Bones and Doom McKee, some of my favorites of all time from him. It's just a fantastic read, man. I love it so much. I will say this, though. If you're going to ever read The Stand before you watch the 94 miniseries, I would say read this version instead of the uncut, even though the uncut's cheaper and easier to get your hands on. The uncut is so bloated, dude. It's a big issue with Stephen King in general. It's just bloat to his books. That one suffers tremendously. Tremendously. Everyone I've ever talked to that started reading his books for the first time, starting with The Stand, they've said that. I've had a lot of people quit reading Stephen King because of that book being so bloated. But then there are people out there I know who love the book, who think it's perfect and they wouldn't change anything. They can't even imagine cutting things out of it to read this uncut or this cut abridged original version. And I understand where you guys are coming from too. I just think there's too much in that other version, man. But overall, I really love this book. I think it's way better than the Uncut. I think it's better than the comic book adaptation from Marvel Comics. I do think still, though, my favorite version of The Stand is the 1994 miniseries, as much as I've raved about it here. I love that movie. I think it's fantastic. The music really encapsulates the feeling of it. I think Mick Garris really captures the spirit of the book in that film, but even does better stuff with it, as cheesy as it can be, and as bad as some of the effects can be. I love that little movie. It's one of my favorite movies of all the time. I have great memories rewatching it over and over again. I own Blu-rays, VHS tapes, DVD copies of that movie. Tons of them, because I love it so much. But overall, the idea of The Stand is really the thing I want to discuss here, and I think this book overall is just fantastic. It's a better book. It's a tightened book. That's what I really want to hit on. But one of my nitpicks, though, is I do think there are some scenes out there that should have been expanded upon. Just a slight bit, not enough to ruin it. If you had never heard of The Stand, never read The Stand, or knew anything of the controversy of different versions or anything like that, and you had just picked up this book and read it, you wouldn't even know. You would not even know, so it wouldn't really matter to you. But I'll tell you this, for the people who do know, some of that stuff's going to bother them on the kind of shortening of sections and segments and stuff in this book. I could see that being a bigger issue for a lot of folks out there. Not for me, personally. It's just a small nitpick, but again, the fact that they cut out so much for this version and there's still not a bunch of character-affected situations, a lot of stuff missing that could ruin characters, kind of surprises me. That doesn't... How often do you see something like that happen? How often could you see that possibly happening with a lot of books? But yeah, for a Stephen King book, I was very surprised to see this cut down and how much better I think it actually is than the uncut version. I wish this was still in print because it was fantastic. It was a better book overall, in my opinion. But even so, the Uncut is not a bad book. It's just... To me, it's a little too bloated. It's not as good as this. This is tightened up the way it needs to be. An editor was a clear-cut help here, in my opinion. Anyway, when it comes to Stephen King's The Stand, if I had to rate this book on a 5-star basis for the original version, I'd give it a 5 out of 5 stars. I have my small nitpicks, but nothing really actually something that affects this book too much. I think it's a fantastic read. It's a big old 800-page long journey that you'll never forget. It's a classic tale of good and evil. It's one of the best American horror / post-apocalyptic stories I've ever read in my life, but it has so much hope in there. A lot of the post-apocalyptic stories you read nowadays are zombie books or whatever, and they typically don't have any hope within the story, and that kind of is different from what Stephen King typically embalms within his story. Here, it's a very hopeful tale that'll make you feel good when you leave it. If you don't cry at least once reading this book, that would shock me, honestly. If you don't become attached to at least one character by the time you finish this book, I'd be shocked by that, personally, because I loved it. I really connected with a lot of folks in here. It's a great book. 5 out of 5 stars, like I said. So what did you guys think about this version of The Stand? What do you think about the Uncut 1990 release? What do you think about both of the miniseries or the comic issue, an adaptation, whatever you'd like to call it? What do you think about all that stuff? What do you think about the overall idea of The Stand, the concept, the execution, all of those things? Let me know down in the comment section down below, folks. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. And thank you for watching. God bless you guys, and goodbye.